Committee. HB 2424 is a simple bill that requires localities to adopt written policies prior to putting in body cameras. This is a bill this committee has heard before, actually a couple times. Came by last year with no opposition. You're going to hear from the folks who support it. But because some folks here had some concerns, the chairman of the committee, the whole committee, Ben Klein at the time, sent a letter to DCJS. DCJS had a whole study, which you're probably aware of, some 69 pages on body cameras. Very little had to do with the issue of a written policy. Most of it was cost and how many Commonwealth attorneys are needed and when the footage should be turned off, things like that. But there's a couple things from the study that I thought were interesting and very much support HB 2424. On page 7 of the study, and this is mostly about Commonwealth attorneys' offices, it's mostly what the study is about. It says, and I quote, inclusion of the Commonwealth's attorney in original planning and discussions for implementation of body-worn cameras has varied across localities in Virginia, but most Commonwealth attorneys indicated they were not consulted or simply notified of implementation plans. So all this bill does, it says prior to adoption or deployment of a body camera system, you gotta have a written policy subject to public comment review. It's a pretty modest measure. It doesn't say that all localities have to have the same policy. It doesn't say that how you store cameras or how you store footage. All it says is set up a written policy, let people know what that policy is. Now, I first introduced this bill in 2016. At the time, body cameras was just in a handful of jurisdictions across Commonwealth Virginia. That day has long passed. The majority of jurisdictions in the Commonwealth Virginia now have body cameras. They're being used and they're not in the code. There's no, although the DCJS way back in 2015 developed these model guidelines, got all stakeholders together, agreed to very modest minimum standards. There's no requirement that anyone even look at those guidelines. And while my bill wouldn't require people to adopt the guidelines, it would require them to look at the guidelines and use them as guidance for their policy. So again, I think it's a very minimal bill, but at the heart of it is this. The reason we have body cameras, frankly, is because of public concern about law enforcement. It's also, frankly, to allow law enforcement to have the truth. I mean, that's what body cameras do. They protect the truth. If the police officer is right and the suspect is wrong, it'll show it on the body camera. If the suspect is right and the police officer is wrong, it'll show it on the body camera. And so we've had all kinds of incidents across the country where an unarmed person gets shot, all too often it's an unarmed black man, and then if there's no body camera, people don't know what happened. And then communities across the country have gotten very angry, gotten upset, there's been protests. The purpose of the body camera protects the truth, whatever that truth may be. I'm confident 99% of the time law enforcement's in the right, and the body cameras will show that, and that would prevent protests. If the law enforcement officer is wrong, well, then they should be disciplined just like anyone else is in the wrong. So, but the bill does not require body cameras. Any locality can do what they want. It doesn't even require a specific policy. It says put one in writing first. And the other purpose of that, I think, is that if a police officer suddenly turns off their camera in the middle of an investigation, all right, most written policies don't allow that. And so if you have a written policy, they say, don't do that unless you're talking to a witness. So whatever the written policy is, we want people following the policies, at least the public trust, at least the public saying, okay, well, he turned off his camera, but that was pursuant to the policy. The vast majority of jurisdictions in Virginia already do have written policies. I know John Jones is going to talk in a minute, knows of at least one town that didn't, but the vast majority do. So in some ways this is just codifying best practices, but it basically says know what the policy is ahead of time. And again, the best support of it is right here in the DCJS study, because the biggest problem with these cameras has been Commonwealth attorneys don't have enough people to sort through the footage. And this whole report talks about, they need about 1 in 75, some say 1 in 50, some say 1 in 100. And then you get to this part at the bottom, page 33, where they go and they say, hey, did your locality give you any more resources to handle these cameras? And there's some yeses, but most of them are no. They didn't give us more staff. had they had a written policy subject to public comment before they adopted it, the Commonwealth attorneys could come in and say, hey, we're gonna need more staff, and then they'd be ready from the get-go. The last thing I would say is, well, what about the ones that already have written policies? Well, if they have a written policy, they already follow the guidelines. So it wouldn't matter for the ones that already have them. The very, very few that don't, they'll have to develop it. They'll have till July to do that, and I don't think that would be that hard to do. So I know I've got some people here who want to talk about it. I'd be happy to answer any questions before they do, or you can wait till after they're done.
Okay, any initial questions from the committee? Okay, hearing none. Is there anyone in the audience wishing to speak in favor of the measure? Anyone wishing to speak in favor?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm John Jones, representing the sheriffs. The policy committee of the Sheriff's Association, they reviewed these bills and they voted very much in favor of this bill. And there are a couple of reasons for it. I was given one example, and I don't know how many localities now don't have or have body cameras and just hung them on the officer with no policy. But at one point that did happen. And you had a sheriff's office in a rural area that was going through the process of establishing policies, storage, acquiring the resources necessary to implement the body camera. And that was a small town within the county. It just had the officers that just hung a body camera on them. It happened to be a popular thing to do. They just hung the camera on the officer with no policy. And that creates a little bit of a conflict and confusion in the public, because the public will say, well, this officer has a policy, why don't you have a policy? So the policy is only to create public involvement. The Commonwealth attorneys, the public will get a chance to look at the policy. It's transparent. The bill doesn't say you have to have a body camera. All it says is that if you're gonna hang these cameras on officers, and most do now, you gotta have a policy. And it doesn't cost anything to do the policy, because the bill requires assistance from DCJS. If an agency says, well, I don't have the resources to research and find the right policy, that's gonna be a model policy he can pick and choose from and implement that in this particular locality. So we think it's transparent. We think it helps to let the folks know that sheriff's offices are owned and operated by the public, by the voters, by the citizens they serve. And all this says is, hey, we're gonna have a body camera. Here's our policy. Take a look at it. And the sheriff doesn't even have to agree with what members of the public recommend, but at least it'll be out there, and everyone in the community knows what's going on with the body camera. So we support the bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak in favor?
My name is Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Jesse Price, and I stand as representing the Virginia State Conference NAACP. We support the bill. A number of years ago, we had comments from a particular Commonwealth attorney that they were in a tough spot having to police the police about body cameras. We are very much in favor of police and law enforcement, and we stand proud to support the Sheriff's Association as we all support this bill. And we would urge you all to vote yes on this bill. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak in favor? Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? Doug, one question.
Yes.
That I would have, or a comment, this is not necessarily a question, it's a comment, that as I understand, and maybe council can help me out with this, isn't there a new rules of evidence coming from Virginia Supreme Court on evidence and kind of dealing with this broad issue? And so I believe that's true to come out July of this year. So what gives me pause about the legislation is for us to address this, and this is not disagreeing with you in concept, but doing something that I'm not sure what the Supreme Court's gonna publish. So I guess I would prefer to look at this next year after we get the publication and go from there.
Mr. Chairman, I would argue that actually, if there's new rules of evidence, this is all the more reason why people should have a written policy. That if new rules of evidence are coming, then that's a great time for a locality to say, hey, do we need to change our written policy to accommodate the rules of evidence? That it would be the worst thing to do to not have a policy, the rules of evidence come in, and no one's looked at it, and suddenly localities are going off and not following the Supreme Court. So by saying, you gotta have a policy, here it is, public comment, someone can say, hey, these rules of evidence are coming, you need to change A, B, and C. So I would argue this bill actually helps with new policy, rather than saying, we'll just do whatever we want, and then it's gonna go to the courts, and it's gonna get ugly, and the whole idea is to avoid problems from the get-go. And that's what having a written policy does. And again, if new rules are coming, and I don't know whether they aren't, but if they are, lawyers will come in, they'll public comment, and they'll say, we need to change our written policy. So this actually helps keep up the best practices. And lastly, I would just say that when the sheriff and the NAACP agree on a bill, that should be a good sign, Mr. Chairman. I hope that speaks favorably to the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, did you have any comment on the issue of the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, I will just say that the Supreme Court of Virginia did just come out with some new rules of discovery that will go into effect July 1st, 2019, that do kind of put into place some new rules regarding copying of maybe body worn camera video and handing it over to defense counsel. So I would say that it maybe is a little unclear whether the DCJS model policy from 2015 fits in with these new rules, but I will point out that the bill as written does say that the policy shall follow identified best practices and be consistent with Virginia law and regulations, and just use as guidance the model policy, so that may alleviate some concerns with the new rules, but there are new rules that may change how people have to turn over these videos and stuff like that, and whether the DCJS policy is in line with them is a little unclear, model policy.
Okay. So again, Mr. Chairman, my bill would say, hey folks, look at your written policy, these rules are coming in, you need to change it. Without my bill, folks may not even watch it, and then I think actually people would be worse off.
Thank you, Delegate. Okay, any other questions of the committee? Is there a motion?
Move to report.
Move to report. Is there a second? All right, it's moved and properly second to report. No amendments. All right, motion to report House Bill 2424. Please indicate your wishes on the voting.